All right, so we want to talk tonight about making bees from the colonies you already have. Now, can everybody see that screen? So we want to talk about making increase, making splits. And so one of the first questions we always have to ask ourselves is why? So I like to use the bees that I already have. So if I have one colony, if I have 5 colonies, that's probably what a lot of you are dealing with. I want to use the colonies I have, and I want to produce new colonies with them, hopefully with a good queen, so that you're in a good situation in terms of viable queens, healthy bees, and all that. We want to be, while many of us start out with packaged bees, we shouldn't be relying on packaged bees all the time. That's not cost effective for some of us, and they're not always the best way to start. They're a good way to start, and I've used packaged bees my entire life, even when I was a kid. We want to use a stock that's perhaps adjusted for our neighborhood. You get packaged bees, they're probably produced in California. The queens may have been raised in Hawaii or somewhere else. You may get packages from Texas or Florida or Georgia. Nothing wrong with them, just not adapted for here in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, there's always the turnaround. If you make up extra colonies, you might be able to have some income to support your beekeeping habit, so you can make some money. We know that Mother Nature has a way of making increase, and it's called swarming. Swarming's instinctive. You can't really eliminate it. People say you can select for it. I disagree. I think the bees are fully selected for swarming. They are going to swarm if you don't do something about it. Beekeepers use a lot of terminology to describe the same thing. Increased colonies, that's the name of my book, so that's what I use. But I also call them nucs, or nucleus colonies, splits, divides. Some people call them walk-away splits. My brother does that. He's in Michigan too. Set-offs. The new one for me is a dirty split. I don't know what makes it dirty, but that's what they call it. And then the pronunciation of nucs, and nuking, or whatever that is. Colonies that swarm tend to produce less honey, as a general rule. That's not always the case. And we tend to think that when a colony swarms, it's a loss for the beekeeper, but it's good for the environment, just as long as those swarms don't go into your neighbor's house and cause you a lawsuit. That may not be good for your pocketbook's ecology, all right? So if we are able to redirect nature, here's a colony that's actually swarming. You're losing about 100, 200 bees per minute. They're exiting the hive very rapidly. It's one of the few times you see drones out flying in front of a colony when it's not mating behavior time in the afternoon. So if drones are flying in the morning, coming out rapidly, they're getting their butts kicked to get out of the way. And we know now that the bees are pushing. There are bees that actually do a job of kind of pushing these bees out. And they're trying to get as many bees out as quickly as they can. And the queen bee, usually the old queen for the first swarm. And then additional queens are going to be produced by the colony that will produce secondary and further swarms. You get a secondary swarm, a third swarm, all from one colony. And there's an expression that some beekeepers use. They say, this colony swarmed itself to death. And it produced so many swarms that it lost most of its bee population. I want to go back. When a colony swarms, about 2/3 of the adult bees in that hive leave with the swarm. So if you've got 30,000 bees, you're going to lose 20,000 roughly, in the swarm. It's huge. Now, how can a colony survive that? It's because usually during swarming, that colony is going to be producing lots of sealed brood, or has lots of sealed brood, that's going to be emerging rapidly. So then in a couple of days, you're going to have a replacement of that brood, and you're going to have lots of bees present in that colony. And that gives you the bees then for a second swarm, so another 2/3 leave. So it adds up in a hurry. Those swarm cells that are in a colony, that occur naturally, are going to be of different ages. The bees are not going to produce identical age queens. So you see that one cell that's open, right, with a flap on it? That's totally normal. That's what you'd look at. Well, you may find it, you may not. But the cell to the right is emerged, right? Correct? And the one on the left is not emerged, so they're different ages. And the bees will actually keep some of those queens confined in their cells. The queen will cut out that little flap off the top of the comb, or the top of the cell, and she'll start to come out, and the bees will keep the flap closed, and actually put a little bit of wax to seal it up, to keep the queen confined. Why? They want to keep her for a later swarm. So you've got Mother Nature timing the presence of these queens. You also have the bees controlling the release of the queens. Now, when we beekeepers go into the colonies, we will disturb that delicate balance. And you say, oh, I've got 8 queens running around this hive. Isn't that amazing? Why aren't they fighting? Well, they weren't fighting until you opened the hive. That's the key you need to remember, is that as a beekeeper, you can mess things up faster than just about anything. And that delicate balance can be at work here. Now, here are naturally produced queen cells. You could also have queen cells that you used in producing nucs, producing new colonies that you've raised through queen rearing. And these are cells that were produced when there's a nectar flow on, because the wax is white. If there's not nectar flow on, you see these darker wax cells. That's more of a natural looking queen cell that we'd expect to have. If there is a standard for making increase, it's a 3 to 5 frame nuke box. And I like 5 frame nuke boxes. They sell them here. Other people sell 3 frames, 4 frames, 6 frames. You get much bigger than that, but this is a standard 5 frame nuke. This is a nice looking nuke. It's got good bee coverage. It was probably set up with 3 frames of brood and 2 frames of food. Sometimes 1 frame of food and 1 frame of foundation, which the bees then have to draw out. I like to give them as much of a head start as I can. Here's my friend in Kansas, and she's going through, and she's got a little assembly line thing going. Don't ask me to explain what she's doing. She's a friend. I don't understand all the things she does, but she does great photos, and I'm using one of her photos. Her name is Cheryl, and her photos are also in my textbook. So, but she set up these nuke boxes, these 5 frame nuke boxes, as sort of an assembly line, so she and her husband can go through and set up these nukes. Other people will take, these are 3 frame nuke boxes. These happen to be in Texas. They're up against a fence row because it gets windy in Texas. So they want to protect the bees when they're flying. They want to protect the queens when they go out to mate. Each box has a jar, a feed jar on it, with an opening in the lid. So when they set these up with probably 2 frames of brood and a food frame, 3 frames, no division board feeder here, now they're able to provide feed for them with the top feeder. Because it's Texas, and a little warmer than Pennsylvania, you can often get away with this fairly early. Here in Pennsylvania, temperatures get down in the 20s at night, what's going to happen? That syrup's going to contract, maybe some will leak out, and then when it warms up, it's going to push out, and you can get some real messes. So some people like to stay away from these top feeders. What I want to show you here is the fact that some of this equipment was probably salvaged from a dump site or from dumpster diving. We have a book by Ed Simon on making equipment, and he's an IBM engineer, but a professional dumpster diver. So he goes to construction sites, and he salvages any wood, any plywood, anything he can make beehives out of, even siding, housing, hiding, whatever he can find, he'll use it. With that opening on the top, the bees that we're looking at here, we came the day after the beekeeper had harvested a cycle of queens. And the queens were removed. They were left queenless overnight. They have brood, they have worker bees, but then they're able to come back the next day. And if you see at about the 5 o'clock position, a round circle, partially covered with bees, that's a beeswax queen cell that the beekeeper has gone in with a little tiny puff of smoke, driven the bees out of the way so he can open those frames and put in a queen cell. It's a queen cell that's going to probably, in his case, he'd have it timed so well, they're going to emerge in the next 12 to 24 hours. You don't want to go much more than that. So these are methods you can use to make up nucs. They're simple methods. They're not particularly complicated. Here in the northeast, we have a number of people that have gone to using double nucs. And this is standard, usually 10-frame equipment that's divided in half so that you can have 4 frames on either side. And you either have, you have the entrances facing opposite directions, so north and south or east and west, depending on what you want to call the long and short ends of these things. So here are a solid piece of wood dividing these frames. These are, this is a 10-frame box, but because of that, the thickness of the wood, you can get 4 frames in there on each side. So instead of a 5-frame nuc box, you've got 2 4-frame. And some people will keep colonies like this year-round with 4 over 4. In other words, because they're completely separate. They can have one colony using the northern entrance, the other one using a southern entrance, but there are 8 frames in there. So this is a way of wintering nucs in some places, and you can wrap them or whatever you want to do. But for other people, they use this as a way of starting the nuc, and then after they get established, they're able to move them into 8 or 10 frame equipment, which they're going to use for permanent maintenance. So here are this large box, and we see it again here. Here you have 4 frames. You can see 3 frames are exposed. You can see a red queen cell that was installed in there, let's say 2 weeks ago. The beekeeper is coming back to check on the status of these nucs. There are 2 nucs in this box. So he's checking them, and he's using a feed bag that he picks up at wherever you get feed bags from. He's cut them so they overlap. There's a little wicking going on here, if you can see that on the ends. And because the feed bags are plasticized, the bees will attach propolis to it, and so there's a center line between those 4 frames on one side, 4 frames on the other, that he doesn't remove. So he's able to pull back the frames, or the cover, this plastic inner cover on one side, inspect that colony without disturbing the colony on the other side. So once he's finished with this inspection, and what he's doing at this point is he's looking to see if the queen has hatched, the queen cell is hatched, and if the queen is laying. If the queen is laying, he's going to close everything up and leave her alone for a time period, unless he's got a customer who wants that queen and is going to pay a lot of money for it. And then he might put another queen cell in its place. If the colony has not been successful, and this happens 20-25% of the time, where you have a failure of that queen to take. She may have gone out and mated and been eaten by a dragonfly or a bird on her way home. She may have been blown off course by a thunderstorm. She may have drifted into the wrong colony because I forgot what my hive looks like. I don't think bees do that, but you lose about, on average, 25% of your naturally mated queens. So as a result, you have the situation where now the beekeeper is going to say, what do I do now? Well, because you have multiple colonies, you have a colony right next door that may have been successful, that you can take a frame of brood out of one side and shake the bees off and add it to the other side, or from another colony. And that's indeed what this beekeeper would do. And then while he didn't intend to make the bees make their own queen cell, in an emergency situation like this, it can happen, and he doesn't lose that nuke. So this is what's dynamic about all this, is that you can have this work in your favor. Now, my friends, the Joneses in Connecticut, back in, what year is this? 2006. I'm dating myself, aren't I? They would make up their nukes in the middle of April. I think with climate change, we could probably start a little bit earlier, don't you? Anybody made up nukes yet? Anybody going to do it this weekend? I'm surprised, some of you might. But you're pushing things because there are several factors you need to look for in terms of looking here. But the numbers, this is just simply an Excel spreadsheet that I was tweaking with one day. And I plugged in some emergence rates, the rates at which sealed brood that you put into a nuke, 3 frames of sealed brood, open and sealed brood, that is going to emerge over a period of several days. And I'm putting in a death rate for those bees that you establish that nuke with, because they don't live forever. They live about 6 weeks total, so at the end of their 6-week life cycle, they start dropping off. And that's why there's that little depression in there. But when you have a new queen, and in the Joneses case, they were buying queens from Hawaii. They were getting them shipped to them 50 or 100 at a time. And so when they came in, they'd make up 50 or 100 nukes from their, say, 200 colony operation. And what did they do to those nukes? Well, a few they probably kept to replace any losses they had, but most of they sold to other beekeepers in New England, maybe even in New York State and Pennsylvania. So that these were bees that were making money for the beekeeper. And my friend Kim Flottam, he nicknamed these Connecticut nukes, and I put it in the book because I like the term. I want you to notice that on the 1st of July, that colony that started out with less than 5,000 worker bees is now up to around 35,000 bees. And that's about where most of you would have trouble saying, oh, I've got a full-size colony, or it's 7/8 of a full-size colony. It's got a good population. Most of you figure, what, 40, 50,000 bees in a colony, right? Anybody want higher? Lower? Don't know. How many don't know? Okay, you're not helping me out here. So, we're just going to move on. The fact that you can make up nukes the size you want. They could be 3-frame, 4-frame, all the way up to a full-size nuke. Well, that's not a nuke. That's a full-size colony that you're making to replace your bees. And you can use deep frames, medium frames, whatever you're using. There are no rules that say you have to use a deep frame to make a nuke. Because if you're making nukes with a different size equipment, it's not going to fit. So you want to be consistent with what you already have. If you are doing any kind of specialty beekeeping, such as top bar hives, you can make nukes using top bar hives. You know how to. You have to read up a little bit on how to do it, but you can split a top bar hive and make up a new colony and use that for increase. So you're going to keep empty boxes on hand. You're going to make them up in the winter. You're going to have the equipment all set to go so that you can make up these nukes as you work your bees. You go to your bee yard, you see that they're getting strong, that you can pull frames of brood out and you can use them. Just to show you the extremes, you can go at the low end. This is a Florida beekeeper. Notice the white sand. Named Dave Mixa, and I describe him in detail in my queen rearing book. But this is a 3-way, 3-frame nuke. And he keeps these going year round. He's probably had some of these going for 20, 30 years. And by having a 3-frame nuke, he's able to winter them. Of course, winter in Florida is a relative concept, right? He's able to put them in, he put cells in October or November. Those cells emerge, the queens mate, they establish a brood nest in those colonies, and then in early February, when I was there, we were able to harvest those queens because he already had customers for them. So, well, I can't use a queen in Pennsylvania, but you can if you're in Georgia or one of the southern states. So there's always a market for queens. One of the things everybody has to deal with when they're making up colonies is find the queen, right? So there are all kinds of methods. You don't want to move the queen into the nuke. You want to know where she is, right? So as a result, you want to have the old queen perhaps left behind and a new queen that you're going to give to the new colony. So I recommend that you work in pairs. This is where it helps to have a bee buddy or a mentor or a mentee or a helper or a volunteer. I don't recommend you use your spouse unless you are partners in beekeeping as well as otherwise. And you're going to look for the queen. You're going to be systematic. And what I would do if I were working with a buddy, I would take out the outside frame, very gently remove it, look at both sides, and pass it to my beekeeping companion to look on both sides. That person is going to set it down into an empty box. And then go through all 8, 9, or 10 frames that you have in that hive body, to look for the queen. If you've got 2 deep boxes or 3 medium boxes, now you've got twice or 3 times the amount of looking to do, right? It takes time. I've had beekeepers tell me, we spent 2 hours looking for the queen, and all we did was piss them off. So it is a cost. It helps if you have your queen marked. So the extra, I don't know what they charge. It used to be $1. It's probably $5 now to get a queen marked. And if you mark a orange queen with a red dot, those of us who are visually impaired, which is probably 90% of the male population in this country, and a lot more women than I want to mention right now. So it gets to be a challenge to find the queen. You're then going to go through and select out 2 or 3 frames of brood, plus 1 or 2 frames of food, pollen and nectar or honey. And you can set this aside into an empty box. I just prop them up against the side of the hive so that I've got frames. I may take more out than I want. And then I'm going to replace those frames with usually drawn comb, but if I don't have drawn comb, frames of foundation. So if our colony has started to build up to the point where they're building queen cells, which is quite often the trigger you're going to have here, I would think between sometime in mid-April into May, that your bees are going to want to swarm. So if you go in and you remove 3 frames of brood, 2 frames of food, and swap that out with frames of foundation, that you alternate between frames of brood, the bees are now going to say, oh, we've got work to do before we can swarm. So now we're in a situation where we can influence the brood. Another method I'll just mention here is some people will take a full-size colony with queen cells, and they'll divide it into 3 to 6 new colonies, nuke boxes in a circle, all facing the direction of the colony's entrance, the old colony's entrance. And if they have 12 frames of brood and they're making 4, they're going to put 3 frames of brood in each nuke and then divide up the food frames. So the original colony disappears, but now you've got 3, 4, 5, 6 new colonies in their place. If one colony seems to attract more foragers than another, you swap them with the weakest. You swap the weakest with the strongest. Or you could have 3 in round robin, whatever you want to do. It doesn't make any difference, as long as you try to equalize the brood. All right. Moving on. Should we let the bees raise a queen? And this is probably one of the things that gets most beekeepers discussing options. One is, should I buy a brand new mated queen from a Mann Lake or Date or a local queen supplier in my neighborhood? Should I pay $75 to have it shipped to me overnight? That's right? Kind of prices we're talking about? And so the advantage of doing that is that queen is going to start laying eggs in a day or 2. And I say 1 to 5 days, that's kind of the outside. Most queens that you buy that are freshly mated are going to be producing eggs in a day. If you buy a queen that's come from Hawaii, and she may have been in a queen bank, which will happen later in the season, it's going to take longer for her. She's been in storage, so her body's kind of shrunken up a bit. She has to swell up again so that she's able to lay eggs. So I've got 4 to 10 days. 10 days, again, is an extreme in terms of number of days. If you buy a virgin queen, I've been promoting virgin queens for a number of years. Why? Because they're less expensive, and because you can buy a virgin queen of a big name stock, a mite-resistant, mite-tolerant stock, for a lot less money. The cost of doing that is that now it's going to take you, again, up to 10 days for that queen to mate and lay eggs. But you also have to factor in that roughly 25% loss on some of these queens. So if you buy 10 queens, you may lose 2 or 3 of them. But that's part of the cost. You're saving money, so you can take a few more risk. Some of us use what I described earlier, the ripe queen cells, the cells that are going to emerge in the next day or 2. But this is going to take you up to a week and a half, a week to figure almost 2 weeks, but not quite, for that queen to hatch from the queen cell, mature, mate, start laying, and survive the process. So that's what we're dealing with here. I promoted the idea of using 48-hour queen cells. Why would you want to use 48-hour queen cells? Who was from New Jersey? Who was here? Okay. you're up here, you're visiting a beekeeper here, and they've got some cells that are just 2 days after grafting. You can take them back to New Jersey, put them in your hive, your nuke box, and they'll take. So you can let them raise their own queen, and you might get these queen cells for a few dollars, $5, maybe nowadays the way everything is, $10. So it's a way of you using an asset. And why would you do that? Well, I've had beekeepers that have knocked on my door when I was raising queens a few years ago. I've stopped doing it now, mainly because we don't have the farm we used to have that we had to sell. Not had to, chose to. And they'd say, okay, I hear you've got a breeder queen from Tom Glenn. That was one of the big producers. He's now retired. And we paid $300 for it. And my last queen that I purchased was from John Harbaugh. I paid him $500 for a queen. That's the most expensive bug I've ever bought. All right. And now I see queens, breeder queens that are selling for $800 and $1,000. So if I can produce as many daughters from that queen as I can and sell them in as many different ways as I can, this is one way for you to get a sample of that $800 queen for a few dollars. So that, granted, she's not pure mated, but none of these are going to be pure mated, except the ones that are already come to you mated. And they're open mated, they're not instrumentally inseminated. And finally, a day-old larvae, the walk-away splits, where you let the bees raise their own. Now we're looking at a full month before we have these queens. The new queens are produced and they're laying eggs. But keep in mind now, for those eggs to develop all the way through the larval stage for 3 weeks, we're now adding 21 days to 31. That's 52 days from the time you set up that nuke, let them raise their own queen, to the time where you have worker bees emerging in that hive. 52 days in a short season. So it comes at a cost, at a risk. But I think it's important for you to consider this. Some of you may be in situations, particularly if you're in a protected valley or whatever, that you may want to have some year-round nukes. These are California nukes, but they're year-round. They're kept going 12 months a year. And the colonies in the back are support hives that you can take frames of brood. If you need to rebuild a nuke, you can do that. You've got the bees and the equipment available. You could have them in 3-frame boxes. I wouldn't do that here in Pennsylvania. I would suggest you look at 5 frames or the double nuke as an option. We just did this. Am I going backwards? Okay. All right, this is where I want to be. Sorry, somehow I got thrown off a little bit. Now, we have looked at different methods of making nukes over the years. And I was rereading Gilbert Doolittle's book. It was written about 125, 130 years ago on the year's work in the apiary. And I started messing around with it, and I've included this in my increase essentials. And I call it a Doolittle split. Now, Doolittle is the same guy that gave us the queen rearing method. He also gave us some other techniques. Pretty bright guy. We would have all liked him a lot because he was a beekeeper's beekeeper. He knew how to speak beekeeper, and he was very practical. What he did is he came up with a technique. Oh, forget that. I want to go back. That used the natural production of queen cells in an area. So this is a data slide from Dewey Caron, my co-author on the textbook. And this is the swarm season that he had in Maryland, was when he was the extension specialist in Maryland. It would start in April, go until June, and you'd have this jagged peak. Would it look like this here in Pennsylvania? Probably pretty close. maybe a little bit early in some years, a couple weeks earlier. 2 weeks ago, I would have said we'd have a very early season in most of the eastern U.S., and then we had this little cold front come through that kind of ratcheted everything back. But as I was driving this trip, I drove all the way to Florida and all the way back. So I've seen the seasons evolve and then flash backward. It isn't too many miles south of here, 100 or so miles. You've got things, fruit bloom in full bloom. Southern Pennsylvania into Maryland, that you've got things that have developed rather nicely. And so that condition is going to be here, well, maybe it already is, very rapidly. And so that's going to stimulate the bees to start producing queen cells if they haven't already started. So you're going to be a way of developing nucs. And if you don't have a lot of experience, I want you to consider this Doolittle method. And basically, it's a method of producing brood, or selecting frames of brood, like we did in the other nucs, and putting them over a queen excluder, but without any worker bees. And because there are no worker bees, we also eliminate the possibility the queen is there. So here's the fancy smanchy version of this queen excluder board. Somebody made for me, gave to me. And you see it's designed to fit a 5-frame nuc box. Well, you can take a piece of plywood and cut the dimensions of a 5-frame nuc box, just slightly smaller than the box itself. And just put a queen excluder on top or below that piece of plywood, so that you have a 10-frame box or an 8-frame box, piece of plywood, queen excluder, and the nuc box. And the plywood's going to cover the sides. Everybody understand that? That's critical. You understand that. All right. Now you're going to go into colonies that have queen cells. And you can use queen cells, and I'm not going to go into the rest of this right now, but this is a colony in my backyard. And I kind of followed my own advice. I had 2 colonies in my backyard. And I'm going to make a half colony. I'm going to make a nuc. That's the old concept that I've been talking about for a number of years, 2.5 hives. And actually I made 2.5 and a half, because I made 2 nucs out of 2 colonies. So I'm going to go, this is an 8-frame deep hive. I've pulled out several frames of brood with the bees on them, some food frames, and now I'm going to come and I am going to tap the frame in front of the hive, kind of like that. Not hard, I'm not putting a hole in the ground. I'm not trying to put the mandibles of these bees through their heads. I just want to knock the bees off. And if the queen is there, she's going to go with the bees. So I don't want to do any damage. And the bees are going to crawl back in the entrance. Or you can shake the bees directly into the box if you don't want to step on the queen, which sometimes happens. So the bees are all below the queen excluder, right? And now we're going to put a box on top of that queen excluder, that separator board, and we're going to start adding beeless brood. So we've got food frames, we've got open brood, we've got eggs and honey, we've got sealed and emerging brood. Oh, look what we found. Isn't this convenient? This is a medium frame with queen cells. Why is this important? Well, we don't want to put queen cells that are hanging down below the frame into that box, because we're going to smush them. And smushed queens don't do much good for us. But by putting a medium frame into a deep hive like this, I've got at least 4 queen cells there, right? At least 3. Probably some cells in production. And I can very carefully put that in so I don't cause any damage to those cells. And what will happen to that frame if I leave it in the system? The bees will add more wax to it. It'll probably be drone comb, and now you've got drones that you could either cut out to control varroa mites or whatever you want to do. I close these, or I fill this box up, and I've got 5 frames. So there's 3 frames with brood on it, 2 frames with food on it. And if you look very carefully, there's a little pink plug there. And because I don't have a pointer, I'll just pull that queen cell out. This is a queen I raised. This is a Carniolan queen from one of those expensive breeder queens. And she's alone in the cage. And I'm going to set that queen down in there and then pinch the frames together so the queen is there. I've got a plastic cap on here. That's optional. That's my preference. I like to come back and take the cap off, make sure everything looks good when I inspect the bees in a day or two. The other option is to take and add a queen cell, as you see here. That plastic cell base that you see there, that's the we call the JZ-BZ queen cell, queen cup. And that will push right into the top of a frame. So you've got the protection of that cell, and everything works out really well with this. Now, in review, I've got an 18 frame hive, 16 frame hive, right? 8 and 8, 16, that overwintered in my backyard in Michigan, Kalamazoo, Michigan, 1620 Miller Road. To my right is my garage. To my left is a slope where I grow weeds. It's supposed to be honey plants, but they're generally considered weeds by my son, who comes in with a weed whacker and says, "Dad, what are you doing with all this ragweed?" So we have a box with a divider with no brood. Excuse me, no worker bees, no queen. No, we added a queen. So the only thing we need are nurse bees, right? Where are those nurse bees going to come from? They're going to come up from below. And how fast will they come up from below? Within hours. So you don't have to worry about the queen getting chilled or the brood getting chilled. It was probably 75 degrees that day. It was late May, early June, around roughly Memorial Day. And I have intentionally left that box with the foundation to remind you, you have to put the frames back in that you took up and moved above. So 5 frames have come out. So we've got 3 left. 8 frame equipment, the math works. Okay, we didn't find the queen. We didn't have to. The queen is staying with her colony down below. And now we put a lid on this and leave it overnight. That polystyrene box shows where the colony is going to go. And I actually use that polystyrene box because I opened up that box the next morning and moved the frames one at a time. I took the plastic cap off that queen cell so she could come out, the bees would release her. Closed everything up, put a little bit of grass at the entrance of that polystyrene box, and let them go. Not only did that colony take, but the colony next to it, my 2 colonies, we made a nuke with that in a few days. So I had 2 colonies and 2 half colonies that I then transferred into 8 frame equipment during the summer, during June and July, built them up into full-size colonies. So I wintered 4 colonies that fall, and they all 4 made it through the winter. Just lucky, I think. But it's important that you understand that this is something every new beekeeper can do. You don't have to have a lot of experience. You just have the guts to tap the bees off the frame, or you can brush them off the frame if that's your preference. It doesn't make any difference to me. Maybe the bees care, I don't know. Which do you think the bees would prefer? being knocked off the frame suddenly without warning, or see you coming with them with a brush? Yeah. Plus the fact, I just love watching bees crawling back in the hive. So it's up to you. So I have put this in several books. We've got it in Increase Essentials, Bee Essentials. You don't have to find the queen. You don't have to raise queens. You can if you want. You can use swarm cells. Some people say you can't use swarm cells. You'll select for swarming. How can you select for swarming behavior when they already want to swarm? That's my argument. The bees sort themselves out, and that's perhaps the most important thing. My friend in Ohio, he's been keeping bees since he was a kid in the 1950s. Sounds familiar. He says, I've been making nucs ever since, making splits. He says, the bees do a better job than I ever did because they sort themselves out. Now, why can you put that colony right next to the parent hive? There are no field bees to fly away, to fly home. They're all nurse bees. So you didn't have to find the queen. You didn't have to go to another bee yard, which is huge for a lot of us, right? We don't want to have to drive, okay, hey, Mom, do you mind if I drop off a hive of bees? Okay, yeah, I'll mow the lawn, sure. What else? Paint the house? Well, we'll see about that. My mother would never ask me to paint the house. All right, so let's discuss all this. We have questions. We have the lights back on if we want, Ken? Yes, sir.
I'm pretty sure you did discuss it, but just to reiterate my point, you said when you take the brood frames to the nuke box above in the Doolittle method, you're just checkerboarding in wax foundation in place of the...
Down below.
Yeah, if you don't have the already drawn comb, which would help.
If you don't have drawn comb, but even if I have drawn comb, I would have a frame, a food frame, empty frame, a brood frame, empty frame, what is called checkerboarding, so you can alternate them. And this just helps the bees go. And it also spreads out that brood nest a little bit so they're less. Remember, you got two, in this model, we had brood in 2 boxes. So I might have had 3 empty frames down in the lower box and 2 up above. I didn't get into that. Okay. Other questions?
Would you say there's a ratio of nucleus colonies that you should have relative to the amount of full-size colonies you want to have?
I didn't hear that.
Is there a ratio of nucleus colonies you should try to keep to?
Oh, a ratio of nukes to regular-sized colonies. Well, I'm thinking that for most of you, 1 nuke for every 2 colonies would be a good starting point. And then you can find out how well you do with that. I don't think you're going to need more nukes, but you may want to, if you get up to, say, 12 colonies, you may want to have 5 or 6 nukes going at all times. Because what does a nuke give you? Gives you what? Resources. You've got pollen, honey, brood, laying queen, drawn comb. All those things are in a nuke. And if you have a disaster with 1 colony, and you take off to go on a cruise, you come back a couple of weeks later, the cruise was wonderful, but 1 colony died. You can reestablish that colony just by putting that nuke in its place, salvaging what's good from the dead colony, frames, whatever it might be, but don't use it if it's got a problem with a potential disease problem. You slimed out with hive beetles. You need to figure out where your mite situation is. Those are the things you need to eliminate. But you do have a resource hive that you can use immediately. Yes?
So if you've got, let's say you have 10 hives, and you decide I'm going to have 5 nukes sort of on tap. Over winter, how do you keep the nuke from basically swarming itself?
How do you keep the nuke from swarming itself? You're going to be taking out frames of brood from that nuke. I'll quote to Mike Palmer in Vermont that he would take out a frame of brood from every nuke every couple of weeks and use it to build up his colonies that he's going to use for honey production. So that just before that nectar flow, and especially if you have a predictable nectar flow in your area, which you would in northern Vermont because of the clover, now you know you can add these frames, and the bees are going to emerge, and you might have 60,000 bees instead of 50. And if they're all the right age to produce nectar, you have a larger field forest, you can add more supers. So now your biggest problem is going to have plenty of super space for all that honey you're going to produce. All right, I think I've got a few advertising slides in here. So Bee Essentials is a good beginner book. I wrote it with Rob Muir, who was working for me at the time. Rob didn't know anything about bees. I had him develop the outline that he thought he would use if he were a non-beekeeper learning beekeeping. So we use that as the outline for the book. The book that focuses on tonight's talk is Increased Essentials, a little bit on Swarm Essentials. The book that you folks asked for was a book on keeping bees alive, surprise, surprise. And then Honeybee Democracy by Tom Seeley, I recommend that highly. And he also has a new book coming out here soon, Piping Hot Bees and Boisterous Buzz Runners. You can tell a marketing person wrote that. All right. And this is the book that we have on equipment, which you might want to have. You can come by and take a look at the picture of the elaborate divider board, which is a hole in a piece of plywood. And then finally, our biology book, which I recommend highly, even for beginners. It is really geared for new beekeepers and freshman level college students, so it's really appropriate there. Okay, that's me. That's my email address. Feel free to jot that down. Our website, most of these books are on there. Hopefully we can keep it up. And any other questions? Yes, sir.
We really worth $800?
Depends on what you're going to do with it. If I have a queen, we used to sell breeder queens on a royalty program. The average queen was probably producing $300 or $400 in royalties, and this was in 1976. So I don't know what that would be worth today, but an individual queen worth $1,000 is certainly within my sphere of understanding. For a hobby beekeeper, never. For a commercial beekeeper, you've got to consider the source and the pedigree. Yes?
You talked about when you're either grafting or raising the queens, the amount of drone or the age of the drone you should have?
I didn't mention that at all, but you've got to have a healthy drone population. And generally, bees that are going to swarm are going to produce drones first. And when we teach our queen rearing class, in the Queen Rearing Essentials, the book on queen rearing, I make the point that you want to wait to graft until your drones in your neighborhood, your colonies and other colonies around you, are in the purple-eyed stage, which is the 5th day of drone pupation. That way, because drones take longer to develop and longer even more to become sexually active, the queens are going to beat them to the mark. So that's where a newly grafted queen and a drone at the purple eye stage will be in the drone congregation areas at the same time. It's fun, isn't it? All these understanding, decoding nature. Yes, sir.
You had made a point just very briefly. I think the new people here, one of the hardest things to do is be confident to split a colony. They should go for that. I have never paid for a bee in my life, and I split all the time. It's not that hard.
Oh, I know beekeepers that once they get the idea that, oh, I can split my bees, they just go crazy. And I think it's a good thing because, you have the resources and you have the potential for selling those colonies. What are we selling nucs for this year?
140, 150.
How much?
140, 150 and
Is that all? You can't even buy a package for that.
Sorry, package.
I'm talking about nukes. How much? 225, yeah. I would think that 200 to 250 would be kind of in the average range right now. And if I were able to buy it, and this is my advice to you new people, if I can spend another $25 for an overwintered, locally produced nuke, rather than a nuke that came up from a truck somewhere in Alabama, nothing against Alabama, Arkansas, Texas, Florida, Georgia. Stay away from the South Florida folks, because they got another problem called African bees. I was on this little road trip I'm on. I was in Broward County. What kind of bees do they keep in Broward County? Africanized. Can you keep anything else? Not for very long. They